My impression is that they're fiercely protective of these children's privacy. It has been a time where we have seen probably more of the children in the last 18 months than we had at all in the previous years. And that's kind of perhaps distorted the picture as far as the Walesers are concerned. I suppose you could always say I've taken a bit more than a professional interest in Prince George and his developmental milestones, because I had my own third child 5 weeks after he was born. So when he came into the world at the Lindo Wing on July the 22nd, 2013, I was heavily pregnant, like a roly-poly, in the searing heat, waiting for this announcement to go on the easel outside Buckingham Palace. And it was so hot and I was so heavily pregnant that I had to keep on going into the hospital to get the air conditioning to sort of cool me down. And actually a police officer took pity on me because there was obviously an expectant media throng waiting for the couple to come onto those iconic steps. And I was getting a bit jostled by sharp-elbowed journalists, so a policeman got me a chair and just plonked me out front. So I actually had a bird's eye view of proceedings.
He's got a good pair of lungs on, that's for sure.
Prince George is turning 10, and going into double figures is a significant milestone in any child's life. It perhaps had some added poignancy for the family because 10 was the age that Prince William was when his parents announced their separation in 1992, and obviously that had a devastating effect on his family life. You can see quite a contrast, particularly if we think back to the very touching family scenes that unfolded in the Royal Box for the Wimbledon men's singles final, and the idea of this kind of family togetherness. And if you contrast that with what was going on with Charles and Diana behind closed gates at Kensington Palace, you know, you do get a picture of two very different families. They're trying to pioneer a new, very modern, hands-on approach to parenting that carefully balances the private lives of their still very young children with the public expectation of seeing them at fairly regular intervals. And in recent times, because of the Platinum Jubilee and then the death of Queen Elizabeth II, it has been a time where we have seen probably more of the children in the last 18 months than we had at all in the previous years. And that's kind of perhaps distorted the picture as far as the Walesers are concerned. My impression is that they're fiercely protective of these children's privacy. They're very mindful of the children still being very young. I remember somebody telling me with regard to Prince Louis being involved or not in Platinum Jubilee events, that they didn't announce it in advance because we all know what kids are like, and he could have turned around and said, no, I don't want to go to the pageant. And you would never take a child kicking and screaming to any event, but least of all one that's being watched by the world's media. Conversely, they are of course really interested in the photography and the coverage of the children and how the children have been received, and will have looked at some of the coverage of Louis covering his ears and some of that now iconic imagery, and the fact that the nation sort of celebrated in them being parents, particularly the scenes that unfolded where Louis, you know, trying to put his hand over his mother's mouth. Every mother watching that could have identified with it. So there's an extent to which they want to present themselves as normal parents like the rest of us, but yet they're acutely aware of this privileged position that they're in, and that they can't overexpose the children to the public, but also sort of have the children only involved in these very highly choreographed events, because that's not really representative of their actual life. What is their actual life like? Well, to some extent it's pretty normal, or would be considered normal for any other sort of well-to-do middle-class family. William and Kate are hands-on. They manage their diaries to ensure that somebody's always there in the morning and then in the evening. They do the school run themselves. Yes, they've got staff, but actually they've pared their staff down since they moved from Kensington Palace. So since September 2022, their family life has got a lot more straightforward because they've moved out of London, which they consider to be too much of a goldfish bowl. They've moved all three children into Lambrook School, which is near Windsor, where they're now living. It's made life easier for them that all three children are at the same school, and lots of parents watching this will be able to identify with that. And they're making Windsor their home. And why have they done that? Well, there's an argument that they're holding out because they'd like to move into Royal Lodge in Windsor, but it's currently occupied by the Duke of York, so that's causing a little bit of consternation behind palace gates. But it's also because I've got the sense from people close to them that they want to make sure that the children aren't leading these strange gilded lives with people handing them peanut butter and jam sandwiches on a silver platter. So when it comes to the couple looking forward, what are the pitfalls they're going to try and avoid? Well, this is the interesting one, because so far no generation of royalty has grown up in this intense spotlight, with social media being a factor. George, Charlotte and Louis being the first future royal teenagers to grow up in the Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter and Facebook era.
Now you're filming them.
And decisions are going to have to be made about whether these children have social media accounts, whether they want to express themselves online, how to do that, how to manage them out and about in the advent of the smartphone. We heard William and Harry talk about this a lot. The transition from the paparazzi following them around as they went out to restaurants and to Boots in Kensington High Street and all the rest of it, to people just on their phones, recording them and taking photos and invading their privacy without any kind of press sanction at all. Also, the positioning of the children as teenagers. It's one thing to have very cute children who are under 10 at events, dressed to the nines and with knee-high socks on. It's a bit more difficult to manage kids who are perhaps slightly stroppy, spotty teenagers, perhaps don't want to be at Trooping the Colour, would rather be playing football or playing FIFA, frankly, with their friends. We have seen George step up to the plate, for instance, at the coronation, play a role in his great-grandmother's funeral, and be present at state occasions, but not far behind has been Princess Charlotte. And say if we look at Wimbledon, they didn't just decide, oh, we'll just take George. Charlotte was old enough to go, so she went. In time, Louis will also make up that trio. That's why we saw all the children at some of the Jubilee events, because they want to give them all equal billing. I think that's in part to make sure that they aren't sidelined, but also to take the pressure off George a bit. He's fast approaching adolescence. Anyone that's had children knows it goes in a flash. The years 0 to 10, suddenly they're in secondary school, they're teenagers and off they go. There's also this big question mark about what will they do? Will they be working royals? Will they have their own careers? I mean, when it comes to George taking a sort of frontline role, that doesn't really happen until he comes of age. There's been some speculation in the newspapers over the weekend that George won't have to join the military. My impression is that the parents have kind of distanced themselves from that kind of talk. I think they're saying, yes, of course, George can pursue any avenue he likes, but they're not going to discourage him from joining the military, because I think both William and indeed Harry and most of the people who have been involved in the military and the royal family speak very highly of the experience. When it comes to breaking the cycle of what both William and Harry have complained about, this intense press intrusion into their lives, I mean, particularly Harry in Spare and in some of the documentary and indeed the interviews he's done, he's talked about the fact that it wasn't just his mother who felt hounded by the paparazzi, but he did too as a child. I mean, that has changed significantly, and it is largely down to the Prince and Princess of Wales. They took a stand very early on and said that they complained about imagery that they felt invaded their privacy and invaded their family's privacy. The other thing that they're mindful of, I think, is the idea that sibling rivalry can create problems later on in life. Harry calls his autobiography Spare because that's how he felt like a spare part. And they want to ensure that Charlotte and Louis don't feel sidelined in the same way. The powers that be are also going to have to be pretty hot on all this, and I think they'll want to avoid some of the mistakes and, you could argue, the mismanagement of the Prince Harry, Duchess of Sussex, Megxit situation. This is why perhaps we also hear talk that when the Earl of Wessex inherited that Duke of Edinburgh title, it was just for his lifetime, because there was a sense that that title is so important, it must go to a more senior royal. And I'm not necessarily a betting woman, but I would put some money on that going to Charlotte or Louis, just to kind of preserve their status in the House of Windsor. But at the same time, they won't certainly want the likes of Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis to feel like spares, and certainly not to be motivated to write about it in a memoir.